Hi, and welcome to the voiceover PowerPoint regarding relationships.
Imagine me and you, I do. I think about you day and night. It's only right to think about the girl you love and hold her tight. So happy together. If I should call you up, invest a dime, and you say you belong to me, and ease my mind. Imagine how the world could be so very fine, so happy together. No matter how they toss the dice, it had to be. The only one for me is you, and you for me, so happy together. Toss the dice, it had to be. The only one for me is you, and you for me, so happy together. How they toss the dice, it had to be. The only one for me is you, and you for me, so happy together. So happy together. And how is the weather? So happy together. We're happy together. So happy together.
Start off with our definitions as we usually do. What a relationship is. It's an association between two or more people. And in this particular instance, we're going to be talking mostly about romantic or love relationships, which includes emotional and sexual association between two, hopefully consenting adults. And let's start talking about sex right off the bat. Here's some statistics you'll find in your book. Most people have had sexual intercourse by the time they're 22. The concept of the 40-year-old version is, unless someone has chosen celibacy, probably doesn't exist. One of the things that you'll notice with the statistics is that people talk a lot more about sex than they actually engage in it. So talking about it seems to give it even more of an allure than it has. Most people are satisfied with the sex that they enjoy in their relationships. So let's start off with just a little quiz. Talking about sexual attitudes. Women are more opposed to casual sex than men. True or false? Well, usually that's true. Although in this day and age that's changing. But you know, a lot of times nowadays people have friends with benefits. And so as long as it's amongst consenting adults, that's okay. So, is there a difference in sexual attitudes between the genders, men and women? Men are more upset by sexual infidelity, women by emotional infidelity. What do you think? Overall, the statement's true. For men, it doesn't make any difference whether the woman is emotionally involved or not. If she has sex with somebody else, then they're upset. Women can get upset whether there is a bond between the person, whether they actually have sex or not. They can consider that an infidelity. So again, some of this stuff gets into terminology. What's important to one person may not be important to another. The dangers of sex. Now, hopefully, most of you are very much aware of all of these things. You can get the sexually transmitted diseases, especially AIDS, which will kill you. And then there's sexual coercion, usually by men on women, rape or date rape, and then abuse that goes along with that. And we hear a whole lot about the dangers of sex and all the things that can go wrong. Obviously, pregnancy could be one of these too. Okay, so let's talk about some of the positive sides of sex. What's the main reason that people enjoy having sex? Hey, it feels good. There's no two ways about it. As we talked about when we discussed brainwave states, it generates an enormous amount of the alpha brainwave, which is the feel-good brainwave state. It also generates in the brain, it generates the chemical dopamine, which is also a feel-good chemical. So you're getting it from not only the brainwave, but also the chemical component of the brain. So sex just by itself feels good. When you bring in the emotional part of it, it can be the consummate expression of love. It's the ultimate sharing if you're really into lovemaking as opposed to just having sex. It also, helps clear the mind because you're totally present when you're having sex. If you're not, you're not getting all the benefits out of it. And certainly afterwards, you feel relaxed, and it generally helps you sleep. So as we move forward here, we're going to be talking about two types of relationships, and I should say committed relationships. Casual relationships are not part of this real discussion. But we look at the two basic kinds as a heterosexual and a homosexual relationship. And the thing to keep in mind, whether you approve or disapprove or care about homosexual relationships, is that people engaged in homosexual relationships get the same pleasures, get the same joys, all of the same emotions that heterosexuals have. Okay, if they love each other, they love each other, just like a man and a woman. A man and a man, a woman and a woman can love each other. Okay, that's where they have their attraction. Depending on what estimates you look at, anywhere from 1 to 10% of the population are homosexual. It's probably more about like a little more men than women, and about 1 to 2% are homosexual. Now, more than that will experiment at a younger age, and there are people that just try things out to be different, and having 1 or 2 same-sex encounters does not make you homosexual for life, gay or lesbian for life. And some people are bisexual. They like having sex with both kinds of both genders. As I said before, their attitudes, their emotions are similar to heterosexuals, while public acceptance is kind of low. It has been growing. I mean, you see the different states now passing laws for same-sex marriage. Iowa recently passed it. It's in the Midwest, which kind of shocked everybody. But in general, most gays and lesbians live in large cities and towns. Why college towns, do you think? Usually because college people are more open in the thought process and tolerant. So, as we look at love, and again, doesn't make any difference whether it's heterosexual or homosexual, Sternberg has what we call the triangular theory of love, and so he breaks it down into 3 components: intimacy, passion, and commitment. And we start out early on in passionate love. You get the hots for somebody. You can't keep your hands off of each other. That's the way it starts. As the passion fades, and it always does, you just can't keep up at that pace forever. As the passion fades, the couple generally grows more intimate. You share more and more of your personal goals, ideas, ideals, secrets, likes and dislikes. That breeds intimacy. And then after a while, there is a commitment where you will stick with the person even when things are going tough, and recognize that this can be impacted by cultural differences. If you look at places where they have arranged marriages and so forth, the commitment may come first. That may lead to intimacy and passion. So as we look at relationships and love relationships, it's important for you to know who you am. That's one of my themes in all my psychology courses, who you am. So you need to define who you are, who you am, by saying, I am this, I want this in my relationship, I need this in my relationship, I expect this in my relationship. And you can look at some of the areas in the wheel over to the right. That'll be discussed more in the voiceover on abuse and violence, but these are all areas that you need to look at for what you want in relationship. Who are you in relationship? What do you want in relationship? And you're going to establish some bottom lines. I will not tolerate abuse. I will not tolerate cheating. I will, there's going to be some bottom lines that if those lines are crossed, those are deal breakers. And you need to really look at who you are and what you want in relationship prior to getting involved in relationship. If you're already involved in relationship, even if you're married, you need to look at this, especially if things aren't going well. But it would help you prevent things from going south later on if you looked at this now and do it with your partner. Now, when I say the self comes first, remember, this is not selfish. When you say, what's in it for me, and you're coming from a position of who am I, it is not selfish. I like to use the example that they do on the airplanes. If the oxygen masks drop down, they tell you put it on yourself first, then put it on the child or someone that you're taking care of secondly. Because if you don't take care of yourself first, you may not get it on the other person. So if you started trying to put it on a child and the child starts struggling and you can't get it on and you don't have yours on, you might pass out. However, if you put it on first, you've modeled the behavior, the child sees that, and they allow you to put it on. Or if they do struggle, you can still breathe and stay awake long enough to manage to finally get it on them. Within this, you've got to communicate. You've got to be able to communicate to your significant other. But it's important to remember who you am. Who you am. You know, you've got to know who you am, and you can't do that in one little thought. That needs to be a process of reflection in all of these areas that we've talked about in this course and in your life. Determine who you are. Okay, so once that's done, you've determined who you are and what you want out of a relationship. How do you find a mate? Now, some of you have done these things before. You just may not have looked at them in an organized manner. Sometimes you've been struck by lightning, when Mr. Right walks in the room, or Mrs. Right walks into the room, and you go, wow, I got to meet that person. But usually there's physical proximity. Hopefully you're not falling in love with a video on the internet, or someone in a different geographical area. Most of the time you find people who are similar to you, who have similar likes and dislikes. There's always the saying, well, opposites attract, and they do. And occasionally people who are totally opposite have wonderful relationships. Mary Matlin and James Carvell, two political operatives. You may or may not be familiar with them if you watch shows like CNN and stuff, but one's Republican, one's Democrat, and they met long ago and fell in love, got married, and they go on talk shows and argue about politics from both sides of it. So it can work, but not usually. You're usually going to find people that like to do the things you like to do. Maybe not everything, and maybe not all things, and we all change, but you're going to find people that are similar to you. Generally speaking, women look for intelligence, ambition, and they check out the financials of the men. Because girls, I'm sorry, you still like to be taken care of. Men, you look at attractiveness and domestic skills. Can they cook? Now this changes, and these things have moved down in importance somewhat, but overall they're still right up there. If you think about it, you're going to have to admit that that's probably true. There's a new study out in the past couple of years that say women prefer tall men. What do you think about that? Think there's truth to that? Well, it seems to be, and that's probably from evolutionary psychology perspective. The taller men are bigger, they're stronger, they can protect you. So even though that may not be a conscious thought that you're looking for someone to protect you, it's kind of built in. It's in our genes that the man is the more physical of the two. Those of you who did the bonus question on the different cultures know that some cultures it's not. The women may actually be the ones going out doing the hunting and harvesting and so forth. So when you're looking at the goals, I just can't emphasize this enough. When they tell you who they are, believe them. Maya Angelou, the great African-American poet, says this: when they tell you who they are, believe them. If the guy is always joking about women should be in the kitchen, barefoot and pregnant, and all of those stereotypical things, even if he says it in a joking way, you've got to ask, is this what's really going on? Is this really true? If there's anything about him that says you need to know your place, then you can assume that that place is under him in the hierarchy of who's doing what. So when they tell you who they are, believe them. Don't discount this. Remember when we talked about scotomas? When we're in love, when we're in that passionate phase of love, we block out all the negatives. Okay? We don't look or listen to the negatives. After we're past the passionate stage and we're moving into the intimacy and commitment stage, then those scotomas break down, and then we start noticing the things we don't like. He leaves the bathroom seat, the toilet seat up. She doesn't put the cap back on the toothpaste tube. These little things that can become big things if we allow them to. But you've got to ask the question, who is this really? It goes both ways. Women feel the same way. Why can't men get mad cow's disease? Because they're pigs. And a lot of times that's true. Men are pigs. I won't argue with you. So, girls, ladies, women, who is Prince Charming? Is he this guy that you've heard in all your fairy tales? Ooh, is he the bad boy? I know you all got excited when you saw this guy. Is he the guy that you can depend on? Goes to work every day, makes good money, dependable? Is he that guy? Or are you just going to take this bad boy or whoever it is and change them? Not likely. Okay, guys, your turn. So who is she? Who's your dream girl? Is it Cinderella? The princess? It's beautiful, carries herself well. Just remember, princesses are usually high maintenance. Could be this girl. Great looking, loves sports. Remember, there's always some chinks in the armor there. Do you want someone who's self-sufficient, self-confident, somebody that runs out and they can make their own way in the world, in the business world? Or are you looking for that 1950s family value type woman, stays home, doesn't question authority, and never challenges you? Which one do you after? You can't have them all. So it's good to set goals when you're looking to get established in a relationship. So here's some keys. What do you want in a mate? Think about those choices in the earlier slides. Make a list. Now, I always say forget about the looks. Don't spend your energy and your time putting a height, a weight, a bust size, or the color of a hair on something. Forget about that, because you're going to be attracted to the person anyway. There's going to be something about them that attracts you. You're not going to get with someone that you think is unattractive. That's not going to happen 99 times out of 100. Okay? So concentrate on the qualities of the person. What do you want in the person? How do you want to be treated in relationship? Are they kind? Are they respectful? Do they care about you? Do they care about kids? Do they care about other people? How does a man treat his mother? How does he treat his sisters? That'll give you a good idea of how he's going to treat you. Women, same thing goes for you. How does the guy's father treat his mother? Okay? List what you want and not what you don't want. I worked with my brother a few years back on goal setting. He had been in 3 long-term relationships for about 5 years each time. And at about the 5th year, everything unraveled. And he broke up with the person. And So when it came time to ask him about goal setting, all he could say is, I don't want this, I don't want that. And it took quite a while to get him to flip these over to the positives. But as you need to look at what you want versus what you don't want. So if you don't want somebody that's very needy, you need to reframe that and say, I want someone who's independent and can care for themselves, who's self-confident. Now, if that's going to threaten you, then you've got to come to terms with that. Okay, look for the ideal. Don't look for Mr. Perfect. Look for ideal, or don't look for Miss Perfect. Nobody's perfect. So look on your list that you create. If you get 9 out of 10 or 98 out of 100, that's pretty good. There's a long-running play off Broadway in New York. It has to be running now for over 30 years, because when I first went to New York in the 70s, it started. The name of it is I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change. Okay, now this is what happens quite often. People look at somebody and they say, oh, well, I'll marry him and I'll change him when after we're married, or vice versa, I'll change her. It's not going to happen. Don't do it. Can you change someone else? Now, I know most of you shook your head and said yes. But the reality is, yes, you can change someone. Whenever you change, the other person has to change. But if you try to forcibly change them, that's not going to happen. So if I change my attitudes and the way I do things, it forces the other person to change. Now, the downside to that is you don't always know how they're going to change. They may push back very hard. I think we've talked about this in goal setting. They may push back and actually go further the way you don't want them to go. But that's why you've got to be who you am. And remember, when they tell you who they are, what? Believe them. If they tell you that women belong in the kitchen, they believe them. They mean you too, even though they say, oh, not you, honey. No, they really mean that. Now we move from the relationship stage into marriage. Now this is a big step, because we've talked about in personality about archetypes, and there's the archetype of marriage, and it's a third entity. So prior to this, in relationship, there was you and there was me. Okay, when we get married, there's now us, and that us is actually a third entity. There's you, there's me, and then there's the marriage. Okay, and that marriage carries that legal, spiritual, religious union, carries with it kind of its own set of rules and kind of baggage. And you have to be careful of stereotypes. You have to understand that that getting married is different than living together. I love Oprah's statement when people keep asking her, why doesn't she marry Stedman? And she says, America doesn't want a marriage, they want a wedding. We get all caught up in the weddings and what the wedding is supposed to be. And the real focus should be on the marriage and what's involved in a marriage. Okay, the wedding is just the rite of passage into the marriage. And sometimes the wedding day, there's no goal setting beyond the wedding day, especially for women. That's like, okay, I've got to have this perfect wedding. That doesn't do anything to ensure an ideal marriage. So I'll give you an example out of my life. I was married for 30 years and got divorced. Probably should have gotten divorced 10 to 15 years before that for a lot of reasons I won't go into. But after I was divorced, I met my current wife, Joan, and we dated, and we cohabitated, and then I finally asked her to marry me. And she also had a previous marriage, and we had adult children, essentially the same age. And what she said was, "Are you willing to make heaven on earth with me?" Now, I know most of you women are sitting there going, "Oh, that's so romantic." But it is a romantic question, but it's also a very poignant and a very tough question, because I had to pause and say, okay, well, what is heaven on earth to you? Now, we had discussed some of this before, what we wanted our relationship to look like and so forth. But now it's time for the commitment, okay? Am I willing to make heaven on earth with her? And my response was, yes. Are you willing to make heaven on earth with me? Okay, it's got to be a two-way street. But this is not a simple, oh, look at the little puppy dog question. This is a tough question. And if you can answer yes, then... Now, Joan and I have what you would call an egalitarian relationship, or an egalitarian marriage, where we relate equally, we share authority, and we balance things. Now, we do have roles that we assume, and we call that resting in each other's strengths. She's very good. She's a very good money manager. So, I let her manage the money. She does a much better job of it than I do. She also does the cooking, okay? That's not because I expect her to do the cooking. It's just because she's really a good cook, and I can boil water. That's about it. I do more of the physical chores. I fix and repair things because I'm very good at that. So some of our roles are somewhat traditional, but they've all been discussed and agreed upon. Whereas in a traditional marriage, the division is pretty much assumed. The woman cares for the home front, and the man goes out and is the provider. If you look at the graph on the right, you'll see how culture impacts this. Notice over in Japan, it's very one-sided who does the housework. I always like to look at the one in Sweden and think, wow, if they're both doing that much housework every week, they must have some very clean homes in Sweden. Regarding the egalitarian marriage or relationship, if you're not really familiar about it, or you don't know how to go about it, a very good book is called Partnering, How to Love Each Other Without Losing Yourselves. And you do what Joan and I do, is you rest in each other's strengths. You trust each other. You rest in your strengths. You're not out there competing, one trying to be better than another in this phase of your lives or not. So you both bring things to the marriage that you do well, and you rest in each other's strengths. Now, you have to be careful of the stereotypes, okay? They're funny. We can joke about them. So this is, when fairy tale princesses get together, remember these are the fairy tales that we all grew up with, and you've got Cinderella talking about Prince Charming over there, and happily ever after, ha! And Snow White obviously talking about she should have kept on playing dead. So, guys, just to give you fair, equal time here, this is the world's shortest fairy tale. Once upon a time, a guy asked a girl, "Will you marry me?" She said no. And he lived happily ever after. Chuckle, chuckle. Now, what can you do to keep the love alive. When you're moving out of the passionate stage into the intimate and into the commitment phases of your love life, first off, you have to make time for the relationship. And you know, easier said than done, especially in this day and age with this economy. You know, both couples are generally working. If not, then they generally have kids that's a full-time or time-and-a-half job. But tell your partner how you feel about them. Don't make assumptions. Everybody needs to be told that they're loved, that they're cared for. Tell your partner that. And I don't mean every minute of the day or anything. You don't have to get gushy and silly about it, but just let them know you appreciate things. You know, you have a meal. Thank you, dear. That was delicious. Whoever cooked it. Be available when they need you. Okay? Again, any of these things can be abused by one partner or the other. But, you know, if there's a real need, listen to them. Be available. Communicate. Communicate constructively. Communication is not shouting at one another. Show an interest in the other person's life. You know, force yourself, even if you're not. Confide in your partner. Don't be out confiding in other people and not in your partner. That's why they're your partner. Get over the little stuff, okay? Leaving the top off the toothpaste. There's no reason that should split up a marriage or the seat on the toilet. Understand the major offenses. Know where your bottom line is. And as I've said before, psychology is not excuseology. Trying to understand something is not trying to give somebody an out for it or make an excuse for them. So understand the major offenses and see what can be done to correct them. You know, people screw up. It doesn't mean they're a bad person. Set your boundaries. What are your bottom lines? And, you know, and there's consequences for crossing the boundaries. Okay, you have to determine what the boundaries are. You have to determine what the consequences are. But just like when you raise your kids, you've got to set the boundaries, and you've got to back up. You've got to do what you say you're going to do. If cheating is a deal breaker, if the person cheats, then it's got to break the deal. We communicate. Joan and I have what we refer to as our daily conversation of marriage. We have coffee in the morning, and we spend anywhere from 10 to 15 minutes just talking about whatever's going on. It could be a dream, it could be something else, it could be the weather. But we have this time every day that we spend together, and that's pretty sacred time. Unless there's something really out of the ordinary, a doctor's appointment or something, then or travel, then we spend this time together. And it boils down to, you know, she has a voice. I need to not only listen, but I need to hear. I need to actively listen. And that's how she knows I love you. And it goes the other way around too. I talk too. It's not a one-way street where she's the one talking. It's just where I drew these pictures this time. But both of us have to be heard. And don't fall into those stereotypes. You know, there's all sorts of jokes about marriages and so forth. You need to bolster yourself against that. Everybody will talk about, oh, they all do this and they all do that. Well, no, they don't all do that. Okay? And you can choose different. Repeat your story. Create a story as you do an affirmation. Repeat it often. as you change, as the relationship changes, you need to change your story, and this allows you to be present. Okay, be present in the marriage. So, for example, some of the things that Joan and I feel we want to be effective in our professional lives and in our marriage. So we work at that. So that we want to be successful in our professional lives and in our married lives. We want to bring to ourselves and each other balance, energy, and joy. These are all part of the story of Joan and Bob, okay? And so you create your story and you repeat it often. You may need to adjust it as time changes, and be present and go over it and over it. Keep affirming it. Do this with your family as you have a family. Create a family story. You know, the Reeses are always this. The Smiths are this. We're very smart in business. We're always good people. We take care of other people. Whatever it is, you create that story, and the more often you repeat it, the more often it becomes your reality. Unfortunately, relationships have problems. Most problems occur because of what? Money. Second reason, money. Third reason, money. There's most problems in relationships get down to money, and it's usually because there's not enough of it to go around for the lifestyle we want to create. So we work too hard, too long to try to make money, to get things, and so that doesn't necessarily make us happier. It's another reason why you should look forward, and if you have time in your schedule next year, take positive psychology, Psychology 330. And so after that, there's stress. Now, most of the stress in your life is caused by the money or lack of the money, or dealing with the money issues. There's entitlement issues, and these may end up costing money. You know, I have the right to a new car. You owe me because I do this for you. So money entitlement leads to stress. When you can no longer have discussions, when discussions become win-lose, I have to win, now it's an argument. If you're going to win the argument, you're going to lose the relationship. So when you start dealing from a win-lose situation, if you have to win all the time, if you have to be right all the time, or the perception is by the other person that you have to be right, then you're going to start losing in the relationship area, okay? Because then the other person is not being heard. You've got to learn how to be present in the relationship. If you're sitting at the table having coffee in the morning and you're talking to your spouse and he or she is not listening to you, you know this, and so you don't feel heard. You've got to be present. You're present when you make love. You've got to be present at those other times. Force yourself to be present. Cheating's usually, that's another big problem in relationships, and it's usually a deal breaker. Unless you happen to be a politician. For some reason, they seem to get by with cheating. I don't quite understand it, but that's a whole nother story. And finally, abuse. That's another deal breaker. You can take a look at the violence and abuse video or voiceover. Now, when things are not going well in a marriage, quite often people go to marriage counseling. And so here's another little quiz question for you. Marriage counseling works often, seldom, or occasionally? And the answer is occasionally. It doesn't have a real great track record. It should be tried, but when it works because an awareness is raised in one or both partners. you're doing something that you didn't realize you were doing, and you didn't look at the whole perspective and how it impacts the marriage. And in that case, it can be extremely valuable. When it doesn't work is when they get into compromising. He wants his night out with the boys. So the compromise is you have your night out with the girls. Well, maybe you don't really like going out with the girls. But, in this case, the compromise is, you both lose. So instead of going from a win-win, you go to a lose-lose. And that's why quite often marriage counseling does not work. Now, one of the things that is becoming more popular is pre-marriage counseling, where people that are in committed relationships and are not married yet but are planning on getting married go to counseling because maybe they're having a problem. Usually they have some kind of problem that's come up. And more and more often with this generation, they're taking advantage of this. Now, this can be extremely valuable because it does help raise awareness. It teaches you as a couple how to communicate so that you can solve problems as they come up in the marriage. Because at this point, you can both still walk away and there's no big legal problems going on. And there's a tendency, because you're both interested in becoming married, getting married, that you want to work at this. Whereas if it's after the fact, if you're already married and you're into the counseling, it's not quite as effective because you've got you're committed on one thing and he's committed on another, or vice versa, and it can work into the lose-lose category. So when things don't work in relationships, there's the big D, divorce. And it's not fun for anybody. Nobody enjoys the divorce process. And it really forces you to look at your life. Obviously, our society is very concerned about what it does to families, and this is very important. The flip side of that same coin is, what is it doing to the families if you're staying together? Sometimes divorce is the best thing for the family, especially if there's abuse, whether it's verbal, physical, or emotional abuse. Then you need to separate. You need to get out of it. If you've gotten to that point, and you have never seen the movie The War of the Roses, I encourage you to see The War of the Roses, because it will show you the total downside of divorce when everybody's trying to get and make the other person pay for what they've done to them. So it's a sobering movie. It's not a fun time. So you're pretty aware of what the major factors in divorce, or the causes of divorce, are. The biggest one is you can't solve your problems between each other. There may be extenuating circumstances like separate lives. This is a big problem, like for those deployed, those soldiers deployed. But bicoastal relationships, people that live in different, the person that travels all the time. These are big challenges to a marriage. And then the major problems: infidelity, the money issues, and of course alcohol and addictions. The money issues could be because of gambling or another addiction. So all of these things can be it, and it's usually a combination of them. Other things are your age, your religion, if you had a prior divorce, the socioeconomic background you're from. If you came from a very wealthy family and used to having things, and end up married to someone who didn't come from a high socioeconomic status, and they're used to just living in a two-bedroom apartment. You're used to being in a four-bedroom home. That could lead to some problems. The gender roles and expectations. A lot of these things should be worked out before you get married, but a lot of times they're not, or they change.
So the divorce rates have been pretty stable since the 80s. About somewhere between 40 to 50% of U.S. marriages end in divorce. Now that statistic is amplified by the fact that many people who get remarried get divorced again. Okay, so it's like once you've gone through it, you're not afraid to go through it again. The divorce rates are now actually going down since the early 2000s, and the millennials are the main reason of this. It's not that they necessarily don't believe in divorce. It's fewer of them are getting married. So with less marriages, obviously we have less divorces. Also, waiting until they're in their 30s for first-time marriage really cuts down on the number of divorces. So the most common times for divorce is during the first 7 years. For some reason, that early on period, people get divorced, or around midlife. And usually there's young or adolescent children involved, which is a whole nother problem on top of all of that.
The consequences of divorce, which, if you've got to get divorced, if that's the thing, this stuff is going to happen, but you should be aware. There's an opportunity for positive growth or for negative growth. You can go one way or the other. It is a major life change. This is not just a little bump in the road. Okay, it's a major boulder. Usually, you get through things in about 2 years. You can be pretty much over your divorce. If you're still obsessing on your divorce 3 years after you're divorced, you need to get some counseling, okay? Because you should be over it. At least it shouldn't be the primary focus of your life. But it does mess up your social networks, because other couples that you may have been with have a challenge, who they're going to be friends with, and it usually doesn't work when they try to be friends with both of them, because you're usually pissed at that person. There's depression. You can, this can lead to all sorts of impulsive, compulsive behaviors. There's the roles, who's going to have the parental challenges, and a new partner will increase your satisfaction in life. Now, this seems to be more important for men than women, but they definitely will help. Now, the question is, do you get involved with the quote-unquote same person again, or do you go back to the beginning of this PowerPoint slide and set your goals and find out who you am and what you want for you? So, satisfaction in marriage. Men, just being married is better for them. Women, they need some relationship quality for marriage to be satisfying for them. They have so many demands between what's expected of them and what they can actually do. the relationship quality is important for there to be real satisfaction or happiness with it. Marriage and divorce in middle adulthood. There's a time after the kids grow up. You have to adjust the marriage. This was one of the factors, not the only factor, in my own divorce. There was no real vision of where we were going to go once the kids were out of this. And you throw in some job difficulties, and things are gone. But I would be lying to you if I said that was the only problem. Things had been building for a long time. If you've been divorced once, it's easier to get divorced again. And this is another reason when you look at the poverty levels of who's poor in America, it's because of the divorce situation. Women end up not being able, if they've been a housewife for 20 years and then they get divorced, they've got no skills. One of the advantages that you will all have is because you will have saleable skills. Even if you decide to be a traditional housewife, you can certainly go back into the job market as a nurse or a healthcare professional later on. So about half the marriages end in divorce. Most involve children. Communication, we've already talked about, is problems. When they get remarried, when you marry again, there's some early problems, and the marriage is vulnerable. Why did you get married? Did you bring the negative patterns that you had in the old marriage to this marriage? Are you bringing in baggage from the old marriage? Are you projecting your ex-spouse onto your new spouse? Step family distress. The kids looking at you, and I have to tell you from personal experience and from observation and talking to other people, even when you have adult children and you get remarried, it's not necessarily a picnic. Okay, so just because the kids are grown doesn't mean you're not going to have a problem with them. And also, divorce is now acceptable. You've pulled the trigger once, you can do it again. Violence, we're going to have a section on violence and abuse, so I'm not going to spend time on that. Now, we talked about sexuality at the beginning of this. We might as well finish up with it again. In middle adulthood, there's a drop in the frequency of sex. Usually, why? You got kids. As you start moving into middle adulthood, it may pick up as the kids grow and move out. This statement, it can be a part of it, but usually if the marriage is healthy, the response is healthy. Women have fewer partners than men by the time you get to middle age and late adulthood. There are more women than alive. Late adulthood. Most elderly couples have sex, regular sex, enjoyable sex. Singles. 70% of the men, 50% of the women have sex. What's the disparity? There's more women than men. There's not enough men to go around. If you had good sex in the past, you'll have good sex in the future. That's the key, okay? Whatever those patterns were. If men experience erection problems, things usually stop. Dun, da, 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 enter Viagra. This is no longer a real problem. It also is a reason why the elderly is the group with the highest rate of HIV/AIDS right now. because they're not used to practicing safe sex. So, as we finish up here, here's a quote from a philosopher, Paul Foster Case, and it's a little heady, but I want to read it to you anyway. It is our job to transmute not just our own personality, but by our presence on this earth to help pour joy and hope and love and beauty into the race consciousness. We are part of the all and cannot be separated from the deluded ones. And so what he's saying is that it's up to us to instill joy, love, and beauty into our life, and to paraphrase Gandhi, be the relationship that you want. If you've got to practice it, you've got to model it. You can't expect the other person to do it for you. Okay, finally, to summarize, you have to think of yourself first in relationship. Okay, it's not selfish to think of yourself first. I know this is a difficult concept a lot of times. We've talked about it before. But you have to know who you am. This is so different than narcissism. It's not like it's all about me, but it has to be about you too. Okay? You have to ask yourself, am I somebody that I can love? Am I somebody that I can care about? You have to be able to love yourself and take care of yourself if you're going to do the same for somebody else. Okay? It's imperative that you know who you am. Next, it's smart to goal set. It will keep you from having big problems down the line, making mistakes. Now, this does not mean that you don't pay attention to your heart or your intuition. By all means, you have to do that. Just don't sit around waiting for a bolt of lightning to strike. And know that infatuation is not always love. Okay, it can lead to love, and it's a great feeling. But set your goals. Know what you want in your mate. Next, respect. Without respect, nothing else works. Love won't last. Trustworthiness won't last. Commitment won't last. None of it will work. Mutual respect, in my opinion, is the most important ingredient in a relationship, and it has to be mutual. Okay? You each have to respect the other person as a human being. Okay? And don't ever lose the respect. This goes back to number one. If you don't think enough of yourself, the other person won't think highly of you. Okay? You have to know who you am to know who you can be. Communication is critical. We talked about this. You've got to learn to listen. As they say, you've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, so you should do twice as much listening as talking. Be present. The best way to be present is to learn how to be grateful. Okay? You can learn more about this if you take positive psychology. And finally, always go for the win-win. Don't keep score. Don't try to win arguments. It's all about what's good for both of you. At times, it's not always what you want or all of what you want. There is compromise involved in a relationship, but go for the win-win. Try to make it the best for both of you, which takes us all the way back up to number one again. Okay, you have to know who you am. And I'll leave you on that final note. I hope you enjoyed this, and good luck in your relationships.